And we want to explore that with you. How it affects the United States, how it affects issues like migration, but in fact it's key to other regions like Africa, Europe, and China. And so I hope you enjoy this discussion into the future. And to lead us into that discussion, let me introduce our panel. Nick Eberstadt, who is the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. Carl Eichenberry. Carl, you got to look at his bio, because if I went through it, we'd be here for half an hour. But I can call him ambassador, I can call him general, I can call him esteemed scholar and a senior fellow at the Stimson Institute. And Paul Grunwald, actually I should say on all of these three people, their bios are enormous. And Paul Grunwald, who is my colleague and friend and the chief global economist at S&P Global. And Nick, among being other things and being a political economist, Nick is a demographer. And the world isn't growing as fast as we thought it was. Is that important?
Carlos, it's hugely important. Everybody in this room is interested in climate change and the future. And I think that the coming global depopulation is going to have absolutely as much of an impact, maybe much more of an impact on business and government and society and security than climate change is going to have. And the reason is that it's going to completely recast the way that we have to deal with social arrangements, economic arrangements, and probably international security. And what do I mean by that? Births are crashing at a much faster rate than anybody, including your humble servant, would have thought. At this point, probably 3 out of 3/4 of the world's population is living in countries which do not have sufficient birth rates to maintain their population stability absent immigration. It's not just Europe and East Asia, which are both shrinking right now. India is below replacement. Least developed countries like Myanmar, Burma, Nepal, and Bangladesh are below replacement. For the first time since we started measuring these numbers, Mexico has a lower birth rate than the United States, as you know, and Mexico City has less than 1 birth per woman. So this is unfolding much faster than anybody thought, and we're going to have to learn to think about how to deal with a world with fewer workers, fewer consumers, fewer investors, fewer entrepreneurs, fewer voters.
That's why you can all take back with you 3/4 of the world at below replacement rate. Paul, significant economic.
Yeah, I'm a little bit less stressed about it maybe than Nick is. So, if you kind of throw a lot of people at an economy and GDP goes up, that's not necessarily a good thing, and vice versa. It's really about productivity, right? So, Japan's a good example where it's at the bottom of the league tables for the OECD, but when we adjust for the fact that the population's declining and the workforce is declining, Japan's per capita GDP growth is pretty much near the top. We will have to worry about things like health care and pensions, because those are obviously functions of the demographics. But I don't think anyone was saying countries were underpopulated 100 years ago. So if we start if we hit the big hump in demographics and go back down, I think we've got challenges. I wouldn't necessarily overplay them from the macro level, not to be too simplistic about it. But if we continue to innovate and have strong productivity growth, if per capita basis is still a good growth story, I think we're in reasonably good shape. We still got challenges, but that will help address them.
And Carl, from a military standpoint, the size of countries and population, significant difference?
Yeah. So first, I wanted to say for Paul that I'm living in China right now, and their stress level is higher than yours about this issue. Carlos, on the question of military perspective, if we're looking at the internally at the U.S. Armed Forces, is that what you'd like to talk about, or externally?
Why don't you just, from an external perspective, in terms of how you see threats around the world, from a military strategy perspective, how much of a difference does the pace of growth and the size of growth of countries affect the way that you think who has power?
It matters greatly. I think we'll talk about Africa in a moment, but demographics there, the potential for instability. stress, take it with our allies and partners in different parts of the world, where you take Korea, a key ally, and they're having demographic issues, which is affecting the recruiting of their forces right now. China, with the demographic challenges it's facing, poses a unique set of problems. For the U.S., though, for our own armed forces, the question of demographics and the question of the recruiting pool that the United States military is drawing from right now, that also is a major factor. Our recruiting pool has traditionally come from more of a conservative base, and as that conservative base has found itself under a degree of socioeconomic stress, we do see that playing out in the military.
So the demographer and the general tell us to worry about it. The economist says, on the other hand, there's productivity, and we can see how it plays out in the future.
We'll put it this way. I mean, of course, Paul is right. I mean,
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate that.
I'll tell you the bullshit. But no, of course you were right that we can adapt. I mean, I was not an alarmist during the population explosion era. I'm not an alarmist about this now. But the degree of adaptation for a world in which, for instance, in East Asia, each new generation is shrinking by 50% is enormous, especially when we've got big debt overhangs, public debt overhangs in a lot of places. I mean, it's not like, if we're at low tide and you put a picnic down, you don't say, OMG, I'm going to drown. You move the picnic. But moving the picnic is going to be a lot harder with a constantly shrinking population than some people have thought.
Let's stop on this point. I want you to have that as a contextual point, but let's bring it back to the United States. Nick, when we first met, you had published a paper and then a book called Men Without Work about the United States. What was it about and why was it important?
It was about the male fail in the United States over a long period of time, from the mid-1960s to 2015, 2016, when the first volume book came out. It was kind of an invisible problem, literally, because our labor statistics, which were designed during the Depression era, couldn't imagine that able-bodied men or people of working age would not be looking for work. And so by 2015, we had a lower work rate in the United States for 25 to 54-year-old men than we had when we started measuring this at the tail end of the Depression. And even to this day, when we're supposedly in a pretty full employment economy, we've got about 3.5 prime age working guys, neither working nor looking for work, for every one that's unemployed. So if you look at the unemployment rate, you're missing 3/4 of the problem.
And in effect, one of the things it was reflecting was a deindustrialization of the Midwest of the United States.
And all over the country, you saw that. I mean, there were rising rates of NILF, of labor force dropout everywhere in the United States, some more than others. And there were also really concerning, at least to me, really concerning indications about how dropout men were living. I mean, half of the dropout men self-reported they were using pain medication every day. I mean, there's a lot of pain and stress out there.
Many challenges, but one of the interesting things, if you look at the demographics, if you look at the map, if you look at the voting patterns, one of the things it's done is it's been a significant part of actually creating the Make America Great Again movement, which is in a sense connected to the economics and the politics of this. But Paul, I want to come to you in that over this period of time, through globalization, America's wealth grew enormously. We were not able to take decisions and choices about redistribution of income. Where we are today, I mean, I think we're all recognizing that there's an issue and a problem. What are our choices now to deal with those issues of redistribution?
Well, Nick made a really, really good point. Some of us, maybe many of us, are kind of GDP worshipers, and if you look at the recent period, as Carlos said, over globalization, U.S. headline growth has been quite strong, and even post-COVID, the U.S. is kind of blowing past all of the competition, but we're not looking at the distribution of income. We're a little bit uncomfortable at times talking about distributional issues or quality issues, but yeah, we have to be mindful that when we have these large changes to the structure of the economy, it could be globalization, could be climate change, could be, you know, the AI revolution that's coming. These are not win-win, right? They typically create winners and losers, and we have to make sure that the people who don't directly benefit from that, they've got a chance to, you know, reinvent themselves. Maybe it's lifetime learning, maybe it's other kind of social support, but we did not do a very good job during globalization. I was at the IMF at the time, and this was the, you know, the golden age of the Washington Consensus. And some people pay lip service to this, but I think it's pretty clear, kind of exposed, that we didn't deal with that problem adequately.
Carla, I want to bring it back to an issue with the U.S. military. During this period of time, one of the things the U.S. military has tried to do is to make that military look more like America, which in many ways has become controversial. Can you give, as someone who was in that structure, can you give us a perspective of what the dynamics were of this issue?
Yeah, Carlos, so a military, especially in a democratic country, it's got to look like its population in various ways. It's a different culture, it's a subculture, but broadly it has to look like its people. And in the United States military today, in terms of ethnicity, race, it looks about like America. The proportion of white soldiers or white members of the armed forces is a little bit high. Blacks higher in the armed forces than the population. Hispanic, Latino, over the last 10 years, numbers have surged. Now they're about equal to in the armed forces proportionally. Also, you look at what's going on in this society, at some point the military is going to have to be reflecting that. So over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been more emphasis placed on DEI. And the military then, in terms of training programs, in terms of setting up offices to set policy, to monitor, to assess, that increased. Interestingly, it really began in June of 2020 under Secretary of Defense Esper, under President Trump. He was the first to have a policy that we need to look at implicit bias. Since that time, though, the growth of spending devoted to DEI has increased dramatically. So FY22, it was about 64 million, went up the next fiscal year to 85 million, and then the FY24 request was in at about 112 million. Those are significant spending. So what are the concerns then? One is cost, we just talked about that. Carlos' second concern is in recruiting. Then, as I talked about earlier, you traditionally have, most of your recruits are going to come from families with so-called traditional values that have confidence in the military. Recruiting numbers came down, but it's hard to say how much of a factor, if at all, was that. Usually it's economic factors, but that was out there in terms of the rhetoric. Numbers were down. Recruiting numbers actually started to come up about a year ago under President Biden, but it's fair to say under President Trump they really shot up over the last several months. And then a final point is, what does it do for readiness? That's hard to define. You know, we talk about a military is a team, so a sports metaphor is a good metaphor to be using. And Jack Robinson goes into the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, right here in Houston. In I think it was 1965. Then in Houston here, you have Elvin Hayes joins the Houston Cougars, first black player here. Why are sports so successful then in moving minority groups forward? It's because you don't care who's playing on your left and right when they hit the basket. And the military is somewhat of that same metaphor. So President Truman opens up the military in 1948 for full integration, and it moves forward quickly. So then you get back to the emphasis that's being placed on DEI right now, because there is training time that's being devoted to it. And the question is that counterproductive? Whether substantively it is or perceptually it is, and perceptually it is a factor right now, it has to be addressed. A final point that I'd make here in terms of how to look at this issue within the military, that the ways of warfare have changed dramatically over the last 20 years. Whereas 20 years ago, you'd put a premium on a collective infantry unit or a tank unit. Now we've got cyber warriors that are out there. We've got space warriors. And so whereas I think we'll always need a kind of band of brothers and sisters that are ready to fight collectively in Thermopylae. But you also meet a group now that there's more geeks. And so this question of diversity is something that I think our military and our civilian leaders have to come with. The old idea of diversity, everyone's the same marching in step, to a new way of war that may require something different.
I'm glad Carl could do this for you, because I imagine there are a few people that can put these issues together to help you understand this combination of culture, the structure of the military, the reactiveness and the capacity that it has, and how complicated it is to make all those pieces work together given the demographic change.
If I could put one, just a punchline on all of that too, is that for all of us here, as we talk about these diversity issues, remember a military that looks like its country, because if we get a military that's too insulated, and it needs a different culture, but too insulated from its society, we have examples of that throughout history where it doesn't end very well.
Important point to add. Thanks, Carl. I'm going to jump to Africa and the African youth bulge. And Nick, if you can give us a sense of how big it is, and then connect that to whether Africa is going to become the world's next manufacturing base, or the main source of political and conflict and tension.
Well, not necessarily a contradiction. You can be a breath mint and a candy at once. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, has a population today well in excess of 1 billion, maybe about 1.25 billion. On current trajectories, its population will double over the next generation. Sub-Sahara will be a much larger fraction of the world's population. It's going to account for the overwhelming majority of labor force growth between now and, say, 2050. The trouble for me in looking at this as a demographic nerd is the lack of training for the rising sub-Saharan population. Rick Hanishek at Stanford does this wonderful work on basic skills around the world. And by his estimate, about 95% of young sub-Saharans today lack the basic skills which really you want to have for competing in a global economy. This is a huge issue for the world. Education for Africa is a huge issue for the world. If we want Africa to save us, we need to have a lot more skills for the rising population. There's going to be migration out of sub-Sahara for global immigration needs. There's going to be new industries there. There's going to be, I think, very promising potential pool of labor. But for it really to contribute domestically and internationally, we're going to need more human capital there.
And in effect, I mean, Nick, if I understand what you're saying correctly, education is connected to jobs. If you don't have that, then the opposite is migration or conflict.
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't think that it's a news flash that we've got a lot of trouble with governance in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. When you've got problematic governance, when you've got a difficult business climate, if you want to put it that way, it makes it more difficult to unlock the value in human beings. And that may also contribute to the tensions and the stress that leads to some of the conflicts you're describing.
Carl, when you think about a continent like Africa, its diversity, the scale of the population, how does one think about that from a security perspective of how to maintain American security?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So, adding to Nick's review of the demographics in Africa, if I've got it right, Nick, that the median age in Africa right now is 19 years old, and the median age in China is 36 years old. The median age in the United States is about 36. So you look then at the good side, the potential that you've got for the development of economic markets in that country, as Nick had said about the labor of Africa is going to be critical to the stability of the global economy. But against that, then, you also have, Carlos, the questions within Africa of instability. But that instability is a breeding ground still for terrorism. So today, over 50% of the terrorist incidents that are occurring around the world are occurring in Africa. Very significant. The growth of several terrorist organizations there with global aspirations, that continues. You also have to consider competing against China. China's the major energy investor in Africa right now. It's the #1 trading partner across Africa. The United States, we take our global trade, 1% of it is Africa. So we're climbing up a pretty steep hill right now. And in Africa, although the United States gets favorable reviews and surveys about economic policies, politics, or our political system, still today, China gets more favorable reviews. So we have to be thinking about how are we going to compete against China, Russia's presence. And there, I think for the United States, first of all, needing to keep an eye on global terrorism, and you can only do that by a presence, by security assistance training, but also being careful not to see every problem then through the prism of terrorism. And that is something that over the last 20 years that I think our State Department and our military has made a mistake in, because you get resources from Washington if you say, I've got a terrorist here. So every problem that get in within particular countries then can get over-militarized, defined as a terrorism problem. The second would be with regard to foreign aid. And here we've had dramatic cuts. The potential in Africa right now and around the world, very cautionary about Africa for the reasons Nick talked about with the demographics. You have a chance for the United States to do some very good things as we have been, say with the PEPFAR program, the HIV program. 25 million lives saved since the program began in 2003, bipartisan support. But there, Carlos, then if you want to be critical or how can we do it better, then $100 billion spent on that program since 2003. Should we be at a point where we talk about capacity building, and shouldn't some of these states that we've been working with, shouldn't they be able to up their game over a period of time? Maybe that's the way we should be looking at it. And lastly, in terms of policies in Africa, with trying to promote our own business, there perhaps we can be doing better as well. Programs where we can entice corporate America to go in, we need to underwrite the risk. Programs where we can work with other partners like Turkey, who's got good construction capabilities and wants to be able to outdo China. Can we be working with them?
It's interesting listening to a general talk about security in Africa, and he's focused on global competition with other countries, business interests, education, healthcare, fundamental underlying conditions. I think there's a lesson to be had in that. Paul, when it comes to the economic toolbox of working in Africa, do we have the capabilities that are necessary? We've tried many different strategies. Success has not been our hallmark. How do we look at this now?
Well, Carl made a really good point, which is about manufacturing. The road to economic prosperity almost always goes through manufacturing, and what we know is that manufacturing benefits from scale and clustering, and we only really have 3 manufacturing hubs in the global economy. One is the US, one is China, and one is Europe, kind of centered around greater Germany. And the question is, would Africa be able to become a 4th manufacturing hub and have a path to prosperity in that particular configuration? Carlos, in your panel earlier this week on China, one of the Chinese representatives said something that really resonated me and struck me a bit. He put the countries of the world into 3 buckets. One bucket was resource exporting countries, by which I think he meant Latin America and Africa. There were production and manufacturing countries, by which I think he meant China, and there were final demand countries, by which I think he meant the United States. So that was the configuration. So we would have to find a way to bust out of that. But if we think about, Latin America, where you're from, resource-rich regions, that might be the path for Africa. That's the question mark. We do have resource exporting countries that are very, successful and developed. Australia, Canada, and Norway being exhibits 1, 2, and 3. But for a continent with an enormous population that's going to be growing faster than everyone else and adding to the demographic force, there's got to be a way to integrate Africa into the system, or else we get into some of these problems that Nick mentioned.
Let's connect these issues to migration. And Nick, I'm going to come back to you. And sorry I keep coming back on every single one of these, but it's actually helpful to have somebody who knows what they're talking about. Do tensions at the U.S. southern border reflect what we're going to see or maybe already see in the rest of the world?